Hi. So yesterday marked the opening ceremony of the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. Beijing's the only city to have hosted both a summer and winter Olympic Games. And just as a point of trivia, this is the third consecutive Olympics in East Asia. There was, of course, Japan, Tokyo 2020 for the Summer Games, and Pyeongchang in 2018 for the Winter Games. Now, there's a lot of talking points around this, so I'm going to get straight into it. Let me just say from the outset, I think it's a travesty that the Chinese regime has been given this platform. I don't think the IOC should ever have awarded it to Beijing, which happened in 2015 in Kuala Lumpur. It's always 7 years in preparation. Um, there is some differences with this in the 2008 Beijing Olympics. For a start, Winter Olympics are always smaller in scale to Summer Olympics because there's fewer sports, there's fewer competitors, and just generally they're not as big in scale. Um, in 2008, it was kind of China's statement to the world that they were a rising superpower, and it was a huge event, right? I think that's fair to say. The torch relay, of course, went all over the world, and there were a lot of clashes between. At that time, there was the unrest in Tibet and there were a lot of clashes between, on one hand, human rights activists and pro-Tibetan people, and on the other hand, Chinese nationalists, a lot of them students, and there were clashes around the world. I remember at the time that was sort of the first real insight I had to China's rise. It's the first time I really focused on it because the late 2000s, China's economy was growing very fast and it was really starting to make its impact. And that was a huge event. Something like 4 billion people watched it on television, the opening ceremony. Undoubtedly, it was impressive. I don't think we can deny that. It was a very impressive show. The choreography and so on was very large scale. I believe it was the most viewed television event in history, actually. Um, but there was clearly ugly overtones to that, or at least leading up to it, when there were physical clashes between those demonstrators. And what struck me at the time was the arrogance of the Chinese nationals demonstrating in other countries, waving their flag and getting very aggressive with anyone who felt differently about it. I particularly resented those guys in blue. They wore like blue t-shirts and they were so-called porch minders, but they even superseded local police officers in London, in Paris, in Seoul, in Toronto. And there were a lot of ugly things happened around that. So that was my first sort of insight into the rise of Chinese nationalism. And I don't think we can divorce the nationalistic side with the oppressive side. I think they're both interlinked as one condones the other. Chinese nationalists just cannot bear anything being said against China, but they will say that they're not pro CCP or they're not CCP. But the reality is these days, although China is not the CCP, it's quite a difficult one to really conclude on because, of course, the CCP is not China insofar as they've been in power for 70 years. 73 years. China is an ancient country. Um, but the reality is they have absolute power there. So it is difficult to sort of, when you criticize the CCP, it will be taken as an attack on China, rightly or wrongly. That's just the reality. That's geopolitics. Um, as for this idea about the games not being political, that is just astonishingly naive. That mentality that it can't be political, that it's not political. Of course, it's political. It's always political. Now, the 2008 ceremony was also overshadowed, incidentally, and there's some echoes going on right now with the Russia-Georgia war at that time. Russia, of course, took advantage of the world focusing on Beijing to launch its war with Georgia over South Ossetia, and there's some echoes of that right now. Putin, of course, has made a big thing about being there and supporting the Chinese. And this Beijing Moscow pact is something that's very interesting. It's something that deserves close scrutiny. To what extent are they ideologically aligned? Well, they're both, wary of America's power, and they both want to offer an alternative, and they both have vested interest in being anti-West. But I do wonder at some point, is there going to be another Sino-Russian split? There's a Sino-Soviet split of the 60s. I wonder at some point where will there be a Sino-Russian split? Because at the moment, ideologically, they're quite close. They're both totalitarian systems that have very powerful leaders, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, who have vested interest in making a stance against America and the West. But is the world big enough for two giants in that sense? I don't know. And I think in the future there may be some clash uh, between Russia and China. I don't mean militarily, I mean some fallout. Um, Kazakhstan, for example, both countries have a vested interest there, so I don't know. Um, but I think it's a travesty that Beijing was awarded this. Now, the IOC says that they don't get involved in politics. They say it's about the spirit of sports. But they are making it political by rewarding totalitarian regimes like China. And whilst it's true that there's controversy over every Olympic Games in some form or another, even in London there were issues over some of the workers, some of the volunteers and zero hour contracts and so on. But sort of controversies that have happened in other games are minimal compared to what goes on with, the controversy around this. I think there are very obvious analogies with the 1936 games in Berlin. I think China today, what it's doing in Xinjiang, the Uyghur concentration camps, the um, the forced suppression of Hong Kong, the tearing up of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, expansionism in the Pacific, threats against other countries, um, lack of accountability for coronavirus. The list goes on and on. Appalling human rights abuses within China. The list goes on. I do not think the Chinese regime should be normalized. Now, this game's, I actually missed it, not deliberately, I'd forgotten it was yesterday, so I actually missed it. I don't know what the ceremony was like. I'm sure they put on a good show. But even the Chinese made this lower scale than the last one. And there's a few reasons for that. I think, first of all, they don't really have anything to prove because Beijing was the big 2008 was the big sort of show to the world. This is more like, well, we've done it before, so this is the Winter Games, and let's hope it goes well. Um, for example, apparently they had 3,500 performers compared to the 15,000 in Beijing in 2008. Um, I think COVID is an issue. There's been new outbreaks in China itself, in Xi'an, for example, and in other cities. I'm not sure what the situation's like in Beijing itself, but that's certainly a factor. I mean, the last thing the CCP wants is to be embarrassed. So if there was some major outbreak because of crowd sizes or something like that, they want to avoid that. So, making a choice of this very grandiose vanity or playing it safe, maybe they've went for playing it safe. Um, but there's other issues as well. I think the diplomatic boycott is part of it. I fully support that. President Macron today was saying you either go full way or you don't. And I appreciate what he's saying, that a partial boycott doesn't really make much difference. But I'm not sure about that. I think that it still sends out a message. Of course, Beijing will stick its nose up and say that they don't care, that they weren't expecting Western leaders to turn up anyway. I think beneath that bravado, they will be, fuming. I think they'll be very angry about it, and that's a good thing because they shouldn't get everything their own way. Um, the problem with a full boycott would be that it would kind of punish athletes who've trained hard. And I do believe that athletes shouldn't be dragged into this unless they have very direct interest in doing so. I mean, if you have a weaker athlete, it's going to be very difficult for them not to have a position. But I think that I do sympathise with athletes. I mean, they were very disruptive in the Tokyo Games as well, and I think that they train hard. They shouldn't be used as pawns in this sense. In the 1980 boycott, when the Carter administration boycotted the Moscow Games, a lot of American athletes, suffered because they trained for that, and then they would just, their opportunity was kind of penalized for something beyond their control. And I'm not saying that Carter was wrong to do that, but that's what happens. Then in 1984, of course, the Soviet Union boycotted America, and then there was a smaller scale boycott in Seoul in 1988. So this very much feels like a Cold War sort of situation. Um, One thing that's interesting, and I've just looked this up, I didn't really realize this actually, but in 2019, China had quite a lot of support over the Uyghur issue. At that time, 56 countries supported it, and only 23 countries were speaking out against China at the UN. Just 1 year later, 2020, the number of countries openly supporting China had reduced to 39. Um, excuse me, had reduced to, I've got the figures here actually, but basically 16 countries that had previously supported China no longer offer support. Now that's interesting. It's something that I think is worth considering. I've just taken a picture actually from the Wikipedia article just to quote this. Yeah, I'll read this out directly. In 2019, at the UN, 54 countries, including China itself, rejected the allegations and supported the Chinese government's policies in Xinjiang. In another letter, 23 countries shared their concerns in the committee's report and called on China to uphold human rights. To uphold human rights. In September 2020, so this is a year later, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute reported in its Xinjiang data project the construction of camps continued despite government claims that the function was winding down. In October 2020, it was reported that the total number of countries that denounced China increased to 39, while the total number of countries that defended China decreased to 45. Now, that's interesting. 16 countries that defended China in 2019 did not do so in 2020. So, although China at that time still enjoyed marginally more support, um, clearly there were countries that were uneasy. Clearly something had happened. I don't know what those 16 countries were, but clearly they changed their traction. That's a very good thing. Hopefully, at some point, I don't know what the figures are now, but hopefully that pendulum will swing and more countries will be speaking out against China. In which case, they can no longer claim it's just America and Western countries. This is happening all the time. Not long ago, I believe it was Ecuador, or Honduras. It was one of those countries. I can't remember which. Apologies. They changed their stance from recognizing Taiwan to recognizing China's claims on Taiwan. So, this is not a sure thing. Um, the Chinese government wields enormous power with its Belt and Road Initiative. I think one interesting thing that could come out of that is when countries realize that, they're relying on these Chinese infrastructure products, these Chinese infrastructure programs, then they end up in debt from China. I think there will be local opposition will grow when China treats a small country like Lithuania the way it does, freezing out its diplomats, basically acting in a very hostile, bullying way because Lithuania voiced concerns, I think that should send out a message to other smaller countries. Um, this is not about following America, it's about doing the right thing. And I think that pendulum is starting to change. It could well be that China's power is starting to be seriously questioned. Last year, CGTN lost its license to operate in the UK. Um, I would like to take some small, tiny credit for that because I long pushed that, and I launched a petition to have precisely that happen. for Ofcom, and they did. They took away the license. So that was a success. I do not think that this regime deserves to be normalized. You know, I didn't watch the event yesterday, but I'm sure it was full of propaganda. They talk about peace and harmony. I understand that there was a Uyghur athlete, and I'm sure they will go out of their way to they'll probably play Uyghur folk songs, and they'll probably really make a thing about how much they respect the Uyghur people. It's all propaganda. I mean, it's a lie. This is a regime that specializes in lies. Um, but the fact that it is getting a lot less focus this time is a good thing, because they don't deserve the attention. They really don't deserve it. I've nothing against the athletes taking part, and I personally like watching the Winter Games. I mean, I like some of the events. I like the River Max, what's it called? The gymnastics. I forget what it's called now. Where they, yeah, the skating, the River Max skating. It's graceful to watch, and I do like some of the Winter Games. And I've no doubt they put on a good show. The Chinese are creative people. I'm sure. I understand Zhang Yimou directed it. He's a great director, so I'm sure they put on a good show. I do think there are records of the 1936 Berlin Games. There you had a totalitarian regime that was basically given this platform. And, the foundations of the Holocaust began in the 30s. So I don't know how this is going to go. I hope Team GB does well. I'm sure they will. We are an Olympic superpower. We always do well. I think it would be hilarious if China didn't come number one, if the US or the UK, beat them on the tables, because, that would just be pretty amusing to see the hosts embarrassed that way. And they get very nationalistic about it. They take, the medal table very seriously. Um, but I do think that behind the scenes, they will know that the world is looking at this in a different way, that this is not just another Olympics. And I think behind the scenes, they'll put on a brave face. They'll say they don't care about Western boycotts. But I think behind the scenes, they will be fuming. And who knows what President Macron's stance is about? Maybe he's aware that Paris 2024 is coming up, so he doesn't want Chinese reprisals. Maybe that's what it's about. I don't know. I know what he means. A diplomatic boycott is a partial boycott, but I disagree that it doesn't send out a message. I think it does. Um, I mean, Boris Johnson said he doesn't believe in boycotts, but really, there's no glossing over the fact that diplomats aren't appearing in any capacity. Not even a junior minister. I think that is a rebuke to Beijing, and rightly so. There's been demonstrations in London and Toronto. One thing I haven't seen, which is somewhat surprising, I haven't seen that much fanfare from Chinese netizens, nationalists. I'm on several Chinese sites like Weibo and QQ, and there's been posts about the Olympics, but honestly, I haven't seen that much ultranationalism, nothing compared to 2008. I haven't seen any clashes even between Chinese students and human rights activists. So that's good, because that was very ugly the last time around. It's fantastic that there isn't a torch relay this time. I think that would have been absolutely grotesque if Beijing had been allowed to have an international torch relay like they did in 2008. So one does feel that it's different this time round. It's much smaller scale. Nevertheless, the situation in China has got even worse than 2008. Um, and, countries really need to explore their conscience, governments around the world. You get the likes of Pakistan, which will denounce the West for so called disrespect to Islam, yet they, to their utter shame, are silent when it comes to the treatment of the Uyghurs. I mean, Islamabad is a joke in terms of their foreign policy. They're just showing themselves to be basically stooges of Beijing. So much for the Ummah, this Muslim Brotherhood around the world. It's a joke. But this is how the Beijing Olympics will be remembered. Some are calling it the genocide games. Well, if what's happening in Xinjiang isn't a full blown genocide, it's definitely a cultural genocide. And the Chinese excuses, sooner or later, every totalitarian regime shows its true face. There was a Dutch reporter who was, he was making a live report and he was pushed away by some thug in uniform. And there was no reason given for why. So I think, they can put on this big show, they can put the propaganda into overdrive, but ultimately, in the end of the day, every totalitarian regime shows its true face.